And as we introduce this book, there are certain ideas that still need to be discussed, investigated, certain themes that are going to manifest themselves in moving through the book that are they're worth uncovering and getting a bit of familiarity even at the outset. There we go. Ding-a-ling-a-ling. Now that we've had two bells, in looking at the book of Proverbs, it's important to remember that it's a book of wisdom. In fact, there's another term for what are called the books of wisdom in the Old Testament. What's another term for that? We call it the books of wisdom or the books of poetry. Proverbs is a book of wisdom. The purpose is to know, to understand, to learn, to teach. That's the purpose of the book. Now, we have spent the last few weeks looking at some fundamental facts: authorship, canonicity, the definition of Proverbs, and the purpose. Tonight, briefly, we want to look at some technical matters pertaining to Proverbs, not because you need to memorize every detail, but because it's going to help to be familiar with some of these ideas, lest in studying the book of Proverbs, we actually miss some of the development that's taking place. For instance, go to Proverbs 25 for just a moment. Proverbs 25, verse 16. Hast thou found honey? Eat so much as is sufficient for thee, lest thou be filled therewith and vomit it up. What's that mean? Okay. We read that, and if we read that as standalone, which we're going to do for now, if we read that as standalone, the idea is be careful at Thanksgiving and Christmas. Hast thou found honey? Honey was the ancient Snickers bar. It was sweet. It was delightful. It was enjoyable. And if you don't like Snickers, please forgive me. We'll say Twix. But it was the ancient candy bar. It was sweet to the taste. It was something to be craved. But what happens if you get too much of a Twix or a Snickers? Or too much of those Oreo balls at Christmas? Lest thou be filled therewith and what? Hopefully you've never experienced that. We won't point fingers or raise hands. But has anyone ever felt like you were to the point of just about being there? We've got hands being raised. Is it possible to get too much of a good thing? Okay. So let's take Proverbs 25:16 and let's keep it right there, just in our periphery. But let's move forward and look at something else pertaining to the book of Proverbs. Because when we're talking about the book of Proverbs, we're talking about a book of Hebrew poetry. And the Hebrews didn't rhyme sounds. We rhyme sounds. Roses are red, violets are blue. I can count to one, you can count to. See, we rhyme sounds. The Hebrews like to rhyme thought. What we mean by that is this. In rhyming thought, they would use different forms of parallelism. Now, we use parallelism in our English terminology and in our English conveyance. We'll say things like father. Okay, that's a rhyming of thought. The Hebrews would do it in various ways. And depending on who you ask, some of these will overlap, which is why we're not going to get overly technical, but we do want to introduce this idea so that it's familiar to us. Synonymous parallelism. Proverbs 1:5 is a prime example. A wise man will hear and will increase learning. A man of understanding shall attain unto wise counsels. With synonymous parallelism, the thought of the first line is repeated in the second line. The wise man hears and he grows because of it. He increases learning. The man of understanding, parallel with the wise man, will attain, listen, to wise counsels. He'll hear and grow from it. Synonymous parallelism. The same thing said twice, just in slightly different ways. Synonymous ways. Then there's antithetic parallelism. With antithetic parallelism, the second line is in contrast to the first. Proverbs 1:7. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, but fools is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. There's a positive description. The fear of the Lord is where wisdom starts, but fools who refuse to learn, they're not going to be wise. You work your way through the book of Proverbs, and frequently you'll see verses where the first line is contrasted by the second. Synonymous parallelism. Antithetic parallelism. Then there is synthetic parallelism. In synthetic parallelism, two different truths come together, but only in certain relationships. For instance, go to Proverbs 10. Proverbs 10, we'll start with verse 18. He that hideth hatred with lying lips, that's called a sentence fragment. If you stop there, you're getting nothing from it. He that hideth hatred with lying lips, and he that uttereth slander. Now, you've got two different behaviors being manifested. He that hides his hatred with lying lips, he's not showing it. He can't stand you, but he's not going to come out and say it. This is the snake in the grass. This is the one that thinks one thing and says another. He that hides hatred with lying lips, and he that uttereth slander. He that uttereth slander is the one that won't shut up about it. He's the one that's going to make it known that he has a disdain, or he is going to do all that he can to compromise someone else's reputation. He that hideth hatred with lying lips. Well, that's one manner of behavior. He that uttereth slander. Here's another. But they've got something in common. He that hideth hatred with lying lips, and he that uttereth slander is a fool. You know, sometimes it's the same person. He'll treat some folks one way. He'll hide his hatred with lying lips because they've got authority or something that he wants. But he will utter slander all day long about someone else just because he wants to take them down a few notches and take from them what they have. He's a fool. Synthetic parallelism is a development of thought where the two different ideas unite and only in certain relationships. Some other forms of synthetic parallelism, or at least some passages that have been put loosely into the category, Proverbs 21:4. This will be worth noting because it's going to come up again later. A high look, you know, the person that looks down his nose at everyone, a high look, a proud heart, and he that uttereth, and the plowing of the wicked is sin. High look, arrogance. Proud heart, arrogance. The plowing or plotting of the wicked, it's all sin. Here is a development connecting all three of these relationships into one category. It's sin. But then there's Proverbs 21:27. Some would categorize this as synthetic parallelism because it uses the idea of the sacrifice of the wicked is abomination, how much more when he bringeth it with the wicked mind. Here's the sacrifice of the wicked, it's abomination, and when he brings it with the wicked mind, how much more so? This is the argument from the lesser to the greater. Keep that thought in mind, and let's look at the next one. The next one is called integral parallelism. Some would call it progressive parallelism because there's a progression of thought involved. The first thought is not completed until the second appears. When we talk about this idea of integral parallelism, Proverbs 11:31, behold, the righteous shall be recompensed in the earth, how much more the wicked and the sinner. The introductory thought is the righteous are going to be rewarded. How much more the unrighteous, the wicked and the sinner. There's a contrast there, but the overall development is what would be called integral. The first thought isn't completed until the second is manifested. They need each other in order to convey the entirety of the concept. Proverbs 21:27 has likewise been called integral. We read it earlier. The sacrifice of the wicked is abomination. How much more, here's that argument from lesser to greater, when he bringeth it with the wicked mind. Sacrifice of the wicked is abomination. We understand that. When he brings it with ill intent, when he worships with an axe to grind, or he brings an offering with his heart in the wrong place, how much more is it an abomination? Synthetic and integral parallelism can overlap. Now, again, we're not going to spend extensive amounts of time on this. We want to go ahead and move forward to one more, and it's parabolic parallelism. Look at Proverbs 27:15. Now, what's the way that we define a parable when we're talking about New Testament parables? People typically say a parable is an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. Okay. Well, let's take that general concept. In parabolic parallelism, there is an ethical truth that is being conveyed or represented using something from natural everyday life. For instance, Proverbs 27:15, a continual dropping in a very rainy day. Let's pause there. Anyone ever had that dripping sink that just wouldn't stop? Or on a rainy day, just outside the window, anyone ever had a gutter leak? In our house in New Orleans, the gutters were perfect. I mean, they were great, except right in front of the front door. Drip, drip, drip. Unless it was raining really hard and it was drip, 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 drip. Not only was it annoying, it was actually detrimental to the integrity of the front door. And the weather stripping. Drip, drip, drip. A continual dropping in a very rainy day. Just the sound of the drip. You can try to ignore it, but what happens? It just gets louder and louder. You ever be trying to concentrate on something? Drip, drip, drip. And you read the same word 836.2 times before finally you get up and you go and you put some kind of duct tape over the hole. A continual dropping in a very rainy day. Here's a daily event, so to speak. And a contentious woman are alike. By the way, who wrote this? Somebody said a man. An inspired man. A wise man. A man whose pen was guided by God. By the way, there are some husbands that are passive-aggressive nags just as much as their brides. And they need spanked too. But the point here is this. The contentious spouse, and as conveyed in the book of Proverbs, the focus is on advice given to a son, so a contentious wife is like a continual dropping in a very rainy day. The one that's always nagging and harping. Just because she's harping, she ain't an angel. There's a form of information gathering, if we can call it that, a form of interrogation called Chinese water torture. Anyone ever heard of that? What happens in Chinese water torture? Drip, drip, drip. Now, for about 3 hours, that might be something that you could tolerate. But before long, each of those drips is going to feel like about a 5-gallon bucket of water hitting the same spot on the forehead. The point here being this: a contentious spouse is torture. Just like that continual dropping on a very rainy day. By the way, somebody should have taught this to generations past, because when it comes right down to it, if you step back and look at it, there's been a whole lot of progress in trying to help the relationship between husband and wife, especially among Christians, be something more than she cooks and he works. She nags and he sleeps. Proverbs 27:15, it's parabolic. But the point that's drawn is using a real-life illustration to convey an ethical principle. Now, we talk about these ideas of rhyming of thought. Let's move forward. We've got on our page rhyme and rhythm, and there is a rhythm to Proverbs, which is hard for me because I have none. But Proverbs has a rhythm. Now, there are sections of Proverbs that are more hortatory and overall didactic teaching, whereas others are the rhyme and meter, or rhythm and meter. What would we mean by that? Well, the simplest form of rhythm in proverb is called the distich. The way to describe it is two lines of thought that connect to emphasize an idea. We've already noted Proverbs 1:5. A wise man will hear and will increase learning, thought 1. A man of understanding shall attain to wise counsels, thought 2. Or go to Proverbs 23. Matter of fact, you'll be able to stay at Proverbs 23 for the most part. Proverbs 23:9. Speak not in the ears of a fool, for he will despise the wisdom of thy words. This is a distich, two lines that come together to convey a specific idea. So the simplest rhythm in Proverbs is the distich. But then you've got the tristich. The tristich is, well, if distich is 1, 2, what's tri going to be? 3. Proverbs 24, verse 27. Prepare thy work without, line 1. Make it fit for thyself in the field, line 2. And afterwards build thine house, line 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Tristich. So some are 2 lines connected, some are 3 lines together. Tetrastitch. Quattro would have made more sense to me, but tetrastitch is 4. Proverbs 23, beginning in verse 10. Remove not the old landmark, line 1. Enter not into the fields of the fatherless, line 2. For their Redeemer is mighty, line 3, and he shall plead their cause with thee. This is a synthetic development of thought, warning after warning after warning, because here's what will happen. 1, 2, 3, 4, tetrastitch. Proverbs 23:10 can't be taken as simply stand alone because it is directly connected with verse 11. Then there is the pentastitch. 5 lines. Proverbs 23, beginning in verse 4. Labor not to be rich, line 1. Cease from thine own wisdom, line 2. Stop relying on your own understanding or perspective. Verse 5. Wilt thou set thine eyes upon that which is not, line 3. For riches certainly make themselves wings, line 4. They fly away as an eagle toward heaven. The entirety of those 5 lines is focusing on the idea of greed, covetousness, the avarice pursuing wealth and riches, or at least lavishness and luxury. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. In order to grasp the fullness of the thought, all 5 lines must be examined together. By the way, you might notice that all of these, with the exception of just 2 verses, all of these are coming from what chapter? Keep that in mind. Proverbs 23, this time verses 1 through 3. There's the hexastitch. Hexastitch. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, when thou sittest to eat with a ruler. 2, consider diligently what is before thee. 3, put a knife to thy throat. 4, if thou be a man given to appetite. 5, be not desirous of his dainties. 6, because they are deceitful meats. Again, development of thought, line by line. There are people that speak of haiku. There are those that speak of the various forms of rhyme and meter with which we're familiar in our modern age. The Hebrews had the distich, or distich, tristich, the tetrastitch, the pentastitch, the hexastitch. They even had the heptastitch. 7. Proverbs 23, beginning in verse 6. Eat not the bread of him that hath an evil eye. 1. Neither desire thou his dainty meats. 2. For as he thinketh in his heart, so is he. 3. Eat and drink, saith he to thee, but his heart is not with thee. 4. The morsel which thou hast eaten thou shalt vomit up. 5. And lose thy sweet words. Verse 7 had 3 in it instead of 2. 7 different lines of thought, all connected to bring together one seamless concept. There's even the octastitch. An octopus has how many tentacles? An octastitch is going to have how many lines? 8. Proverbs 23, beginning in verse 22. Hearken unto thy father that begat thee. Number 1. Despise not thy mother when she is old. Number 2. Buy the truth and sell it not. Number 3. Also wisdom and instruction and understanding. Number 4. The father of the righteous shall greatly rejoice. Number 5. He that begetteth the wise child shall have joy of him. Number 6. Thy father and thy mother shall be glad. 7. And she that bare thee shall rejoice. 8. So, there are lines of 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. And then there are those sections that will use multiple lines and different measures, but all culminating into what's called a mashal ode. Proverbs 23 includes that as well. It begins at verse 29. Who hath woe? Who hath sorrow? Who hath babblings? Who hath contentions? Who hath wounds without cause? Who hath redness of eyes? They that tarry long at the wine, they that go to seek mixed wine. Look not thou upon the wine when it is red, when it giveth its color to the cup, when it moveth itself aright. At the last it biteth like a serpent, and stingeth like an adder. Thine eye shall behold strange women, thy mouth shall utter perverse things. Yea, thou shalt be as one that lieth at the top of the mast. Or in the midst of the seers, he that lieth at the top of the mast. They've stricken me, thou shalt say. I was not sick. They've beaten me. I felt it not. I didn't even feel it. When shall I awake? I shall seek it yet again. Verses 29 through 35 all discuss the danger of the beverage use of alcohol. Our point being this. We take the book of Proverbs and we note the Hebrew rhyme and rhythm, and it's going to help us in seeing what thoughts go together and are directly connected. Proverbs 23 actually contains a form of every stitch except for the tri-stitch. You can find that in Proverbs 24 and elsewhere. But Proverbs 23 serves as an exhibition of the different rhythms that can be found in Hebrew poetry. Now, having said all of that, let's come back to what we were discussing a moment ago in Proverbs 25 as we got started. We looked at verse 16, right? Hast thou found honey? Eat so much as is sufficient for thee, lest thou be filled therewith, and vomit it. Okay? That's not where it stops. You can have too much of a good thing, and people can get too much of you. Look at verse 17. Withdraw thy foot from thy neighbor's house, lest he be weary of thee, and so hate thee. Be weary of thee. Well, we wouldn't say I'm weary of something. What would we say? I'm tired. Lest he be tired of thee, and so hate thee. There is much social counsel given in the book of Proverbs in terms of regarding our interaction with one another and our awareness of how we're impacting each other. There's a phrase that we'll hear younger folks say, read the room. Well, the wise man of Proverbs didn't use those exact words. But just as he gave advice not to consume too much honey, he also gave advice not to consume too much of the time of the friend, or not to be the one. Anyone ever watch Looney Tunes growing up? You remember Spike? We're going to take Spike, we're going to do Spike. You got this big bulldog, all brawny and tough, and there's another dog following along behind him. I can't remember what that scrawny thing's name was. But he was one of those hyperactive, I don't know, Chihuahua, Pikachu looking things, just bouncing all over the place. Every time another one of those skits started, I needed Advil. There are people that act that way. They're the ones that are imposing. They're the ones that are, well, withdraw thy foot from thy neighbor's house, lest he be weary of thee. Would the word clingy be applicable? So, if we obtain a grasp of the way the Hebrews put their thought together, and they put these lines together, Proverbs 25, 16, and 17 actually form the heptastitch. Hast thou found honey? 1. Eat so much as sufficient for thee. 2. Lest thou be filled therewith. 3. And vomit it. 4. Withdraw thy foot from thy neighbor's house. 5. Lest he be weary of thee. 6. And so hate thee. 7. This is just one example. As we work our way through the book of Proverbs, each of us needs to be careful in identifying whether or not the verse is standalone or whether or not they're connected. There is a very real sense in which each verse in the book of Proverbs in some way plays off of or springs from the ideas that had preceded it, whether in the immediate verse or in the preceding context of the chapter. That being said, there are some verses that do stand so independently that they in and of themselves serve as life principles and guidelines. All these things being said, let's leave this idea of the rhyme and rhythm, and let's look briefly at something that we'll actually start here when next we meet. When we were looking at Proverbs 23, there was a word that appeared repeatedly. It was the word heart. Now, one time in Proverbs 23 and twice in the entire book, the word heart is translated from nephesh. It's the idea of soul or spirit, creature. The Lord God breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. Man became a living nephesh, soul. Twice in the book of Proverbs, the word heart is translated from nephesh. But the word translated heart every other time is the Hebrew word lab or lebab. And that word is used in the book of Proverbs some 96 times. Matter of fact, the only word that appears more frequently in the book of Proverbs than that is going to be the Hebrew idea of shakam or shakma, wisdom. Wisdom followed by lab. The heart, as it's translated, pertains to the inner man, the mind or the intellect, but it goes right down to the center of something. You've heard this illustrated. You've heard me illustrate this more than one occasion. The idea of what's your center. Or we might ask it this way, who are you? Right down to the core, right down to the center. When it gets down to the heart of the matter or the matter of your heart, who are you? You work your way through the book of Proverbs, and there are times when you read the word heart and it's going to have the ring of the way that we use the word heart. The concept of sincerity or the emotions or the inner person in a general way. But there are going to be many occasions in the book of Proverbs when you see the word heart, or if you really do a word study and you start marking the other times when lab or labab appears, but it's not translated heart. Sometimes it's translated understanding or wisdom. In Proverbs 23, at the end of the chapter, it was translated as midst. In the midst of the sea, out in the middle of everything. If you mark when this word appears, other than just when it's translated as heart, but also when it's translated as understanding or wisdom, some interesting ideas arise. Who are you? Down to the core, down to the center, do you know who you are? There are behaviors and manners of conduct that indicate that a person is having an identity crisis. An identity crisis means what? A person doesn't know who he is. Proverbs 4:23, keep thy heart, Lab, with all diligence, for out of it are the issues of life. Guard who you are, son. You decide who you're going to be, and you guard that, you protect it. You guard your heart in terms of the influences. You keep your heart with all diligence. You guard what goes into it. You guard what comes out of it. Out of it are the issues of life. You decide who you're going to be. But let's leave the occasions when it's translated as heart in the English language, and let's look at some of those occasions that don't stand out quite as obviously to us. Proverbs 6:32. Whoso committeth adultery with a woman lacketh understanding. The word translated understanding is that Hebrew word lab or labab. The one that commits adultery doesn't know who he is. He's having an identity crisis. Now, there are times when people are having identity crisis because they've chosen to have an identity crisis. They've chosen that they want to try to be someone else or something else. They don't know who they are. The one who's having an identity crisis is not necessarily a victim. Sometimes those who are having identity crisis are dealing with depression. Then sometimes those that are having identity crisis are simply dealing with their own arrogance. He that committeth adultery with a woman lacketh understanding. He doesn't know who he is. And he that doeth it destroys his own soul. Or look at Proverbs 7:7. I looked out the window of my house, I looked through my casement, and I discerned among the youths, I beheld among the simple ones a young man void of understanding. I looked out my window and I saw a young man who didn't know who he was. And I could tell that he didn't know who he was because he went walking straight down the way to her corner. Yes, the book of Proverbs talks about the street corner girl. And the one that doesn't know who he is will find himself in the clutches of the one who's going to shape him to be whatever she wants him to be for the minute. Proverbs 9:4. Whoso is simple, let him turn in hither. This is wisdom calling. Whoso is simple, let him turn in hither, and he that lacketh understanding, she saith, to the one that doesn't know who he is, the one that is being tossed about in the sea with no direction, no concept of his very identity. Wisdom is crying to that individual who's searching through life to find his place or her place. Have you ever been there? Have you ever had a breakdown in identity? Not knowing exactly who you were or what your place was? This book is for the person who needs not to find, but to decide who he or she is and shape self into the identity that God desires for each person. But the one who goes following off after sin doesn't know who he is. Here comes a bell. Proverbs 9:16. Here is the foolish woman calling, whoso is simple, let him turn in hither. And to him that lacketh understanding, she says to him, Those that don't know who they are being called by two different voices. The voice of wisdom and the voice of want. Which will be pursued? A couple more verses. Proverbs 10:13. In the lips of him that hath understanding, wisdom is found, but a rod is for the back of him that is void of understanding. Two different words translated understanding here. The first one is a form of being, the one that has perspective, that sees things from multiple points of view. But to him that is void of understanding, a rod is for the back of him that is void of understanding. That word is a form of lebab. A rod is for the back of the one who doesn't know who he is, because the only thing that's going to whip some identity into him is a whipping. The only thing that's going to make him decide to be something other than the miscreant he has become is punishment, penalty, consequence, and repercussion. Have you ever been there? Have you ever found yourself being the person you really didn't want to be? And the only thing that changed the direction was the consequences of the decisions. And so the decision process started to change. A rod is for the back of him that's void of understanding. Children don't know who they are. And there are times that if we just let them grow like weeds without any direction, they're not going to know who they are when they become adults, and they're going to be more dangerous to themselves and everyone around them. A rod is for him that is void of understanding. And the sooner the rod and instruction is applied, the better off they'll be. Last one, Proverbs 10:21, the lips of the righteous feed many, but fools die for want of wisdom. Here the word translated wisdom is lebab, and it carries the idea of the center. They don't have any center. They don't know who they are. And because they don't know who they are, it will be their demise. We'll pick up at Proverbs 11:12 next week. Thank you for your time tonight.